Boldwood presents The Secret Keeper, written by Renita D'Silva and read by Nikki Patel. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. And now here is my secret, a very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince. Part 1. Chapter 1. Rani. India, 1938. Rani scurries down the winding corridors of the palace, pulling the veil of her maid's sari further down, the better to cover her face, her anklets chiming in time with her heartbeat, especially loud when she passes sentries or courtiers, afraid of being caught out. But the maid's sari is the perfect disguise. She does not merit a second glance, just another of the plentiful anonymous serving the king and his entourage, keeping the palace and its extravagant furnishings polished and blemish-free. The first few times she navigated her way out of this maze of a palace, she'd got hopelessly lost. But now she is sure-footed. Any minute now. There. She spies one of the exits into the fort that surrounds the palace. It is a bejewelled archway, framing a sliver of bright gold sky, scudded with pillowy clouds, pierced by the uncompromising grey rectangle top of this section of the embattlements. Silhouettes of guards, swords glinting, cast shadowy aspersions upon the golden spill of light as they march back and forth. Head down, she hurries through the gateway, her veiled gaze fixed on the tantalising slice of sky. She's almost out of the exit, bowing acknowledgement to the guards when... Wait! The deadly ceremonial sheathed sword, concealed under her sari, which she has stolen from her father, bumps against her thigh, sharp as a tiger's tooth and just as dangerous. Chapter 2. Esme. England, 1990. Feel free to sit where you'd like. Use the couch if you prefer. Dr. Coates smiles. Her voice is mellow, like sinking into a lavender-scented pillow at the end of an arduous day. Esme had found her in the directory under counsellors. Dr. Sally Coates had a whole host of degrees and publications after her name. But what clinched it for Esme were the testimonials. I was floundering. No clue what was wrong with me, unable to face the day. A few sessions with Dr. Coates, and I feel good as new. Sally Coates is a miracle worker. Esme could do with a miracle or two, which is why she is here. A large room. No adornments. Just plain white walls like blank pages. A couch also upholstered white, piled high with marshmallow pink cushions, the effect that of a summer sky at dawn kissed by dreamy cloud puffs. A walnut desk, polished and gleaming, behind which sits Dr. Coates, a notebook open in front of her, a box of tissues beside it, twirling a pen in her hands, unvarnished nails, long, elegant fingers, like the rest of her. A tall, dignified woman, wearing a plain black dress and very little makeup, if any. Brown hair pulled back in a bun. Bright, intelligent eyes behind square, no-nonsense kind of frames. A pleasing face. One Esme instantly trusts. At least, judging from looks alone, she's made the right choice. Esme eschews the couch, tempting though it is, for the high-backed chair opposite Dr. Coates. Time enough for it, if she chooses to continue the sessions depending on how this one goes. The chair is surprisingly comfortable, and she sinks gladly into it, surreptitiously kicking off, with great relief, the new shoes she'd bought in the sales, 75% off. Too good to be true, of course, as they've started to bite. So, what brings you here today, Miss... Please call me Esme. Dr. Coates smiles warmly. Very well, Esme. And I'm Sally. So, what prompted you to seek me out? Esme scrunches her toes, takes a deep breath. My dad passed away recently. The phone had just rung as Esme was getting into her bath. It was something she looked forward to after a long day at work, her little treat to herself before facing the no doubt sleepless night ahead. She suffered terribly from insomnia since her breakup, when all the thoughts she'd managed to evade during the day ambushed and tormented. She considered letting it ring, inhaling the bergamot-infused steam, feeling her body, more unwieldy every day, relax in anticipation. The weariness which seemed to have settled into her very bones, making itself comfortable, very much at home, ease a little. But it could be Robbie, calling from uni. She could go days without hearing from her son, and then he'd call twice in 1 week, at the oddest of times, expecting her to answer with that careless entitlement of youth, piqued when she didn't, complaining the next time they talked, "Ma, where were you? I tried and tried to call you." It could be her brother, who also could go months without keeping in touch, and then ring out of the blue to say, "I read this and thought of you," and go on to recite, dissect, and discuss whatever it was that he thought she'd enjoy. Or it could be Philip, reaching out. Why would he, when you broke up with him? But, as always, hope had trumped reason, and she'd shrugged on her bathrobe, fraying, threadbare, once purple, her favourite colour, now grey, but deeply cherished. Robbie had gifted it to her one Christmas, years ago, bought from money he'd earned cleaning cars and doing odd jobs for the neighbours, and she's worn it every day since. She'd picked up the phone mid-ring, the sudden silence in the wake of the interrupted shrillness, seething, ominous. "Hello? It's Eve." A woman. Her body slumped, all the oomph going out of it, and she realised, disappointment acrid in her throat, that she'd been expecting to hear Philip's rich voice that always brought to mind hot chocolate spiced with cinnamon. Eve. She didn't know an Eve except for, of course, Eve, the director of the hospice. She didn't recognise the soft cadence in this woman's usually crisp voice. And she knew then. She'd collapsed onto her bed, tears brimming, salty, bitter, even before Eve spelled out the words. "He's gone, I'm afraid. I'm so very sorry." Much later, when she stumbled into the bathroom, the bathwater was stone cold, like her father's body, she imagined. Unable to stop shivering, the bathrobe no comfort. Chapter 3. Rani. Childhood. Rani was her father's pet. Her earliest memory is of her father whispering, "I might no longer be Crown Prince of Devonpur, but I am the father of a queen." "Baba," she'd giggle, "I'm not a queen." "You are Our queen, Rani, precious one. It's why we named you Rani. It means queen in Hindi. They spoke English at home. Baba insisted upon it, but he also made sure that Rani and her brother were fluent in the language of whichever country they happened to live in during their eclectic childhood spent travelling all over Europe. "Why are you no longer crown prince?" Rani would ask. It never failed to bring a smile to Baba's face. "Ah, you want to hear your favourite story, then?" "Yes." Rani would beam. For although it sounded sad, it was really a happy tale of how Baba met Mama, her favourite story until her little brother's birth superseded it. "During my holidays in my second year at Cambridge," her father began. "Where you met fellow Marxists," Rani interrupted, for she had heard this story so many times she knew it by heart. "That's right. We were holidaying in Europe, and while in Dusseldorf, one of my friends wanted to buy something for the girl he loved, and we went to this jeweler the locals recommended. We were served by the most beautiful girl I had ever set eyes on." "Mama," Rani breathed. "Yes," Baba would say, smiling at Mama, his gaze warm and soft in that special way it became when he looked at her. "I knew then and there that we were destined to be together. My friends went on to the next country on our meticulously mapped itinerary. I stayed back in Germany, and, well, you know my gift with languages. I pick them up so easily." "I do too." "So you do." Baba smiling broadly at her. "Our Rani, our queen." "What happened next, Baba?" "Well, I visited the shop every day and wooed your mama in German that got better and better. Her father kept sending me away." "Oppa," Rani giggled. "He's indulgent with you, but with me, then, he was very harsh." Baba winced in remembrance. Rani giggled some more. She knew how this story ended. "But I kept going back, and my sheer persistence paid off." "You married her." "I did." "So you had to give up your throne, for your father wanted you to marry an Indian princess, but you wanted Mama." "I did, but I don't regret it one bit." "And," her father leaning close, his spiced breath hot and ticklish in her ear, "do you want to know the best bit?" She already knew, and like always, her stomach tightened with anticipation, even as she breathed. "What, Baba?" "The best part is that you came along soon after, making us a family." "Yes." She snuggled closer to her father. "You haven't been back to India. Do you miss it?" "I do. But I carry it within me. And with you and your mama, I've travelled the world, seen so much, have had such a rich life. You and Mama are my world, my life, my home." Baba planted a kiss on his wife's lips, above their daughter's head. "You married Mama. She gave birth to a queen. And you lived happily ever after." Rani cheered. "I am living happily ever after." "The best story ever. Better than all the fairy tales in the world." "And do you know something, Rani, love? You are the icing on our cake, the one who makes everything worthwhile. You are our lucky charm, our good fairy." She beamed. "I am?" "You surely are. And more beautiful, precious, and intelligent than any fairy in this world and the next." Baba and Mama's meeting became Rani's second favourite story when Arjun was born, her first encounter with her new sibling taking precedence from then on. We were so worried, there being such a big age gap between the two of you, that you might not take to him, her father loved to say. But when he was born... Yes? You paused at the threshold to the room. Your mama was holding him. I was worried that you might be jealous, feeling left out, usurped. But then I saw your expression. You were mesmerized. You entered the room on tiptoes. I don't want to wake him, Baba, you whispered, already a caring big sister. And I knew then that we had fretted for nothing. We should have trusted our wonderful Rani, mature even at 9, to always do the right thing. Baba smiling warmly at her. Your mother placed your newborn brother in your lap, and... Her father always had a faraway look at this point, a wistful smile playing on his face as he gazed into the past. And, Rani prompted, even though she knew what came next. Your expression as you held him. I'll never forget it. What was it? She whispered. Awe and magic and wonder and, most of all, Rani prompted. Love. Rani was her father's shadow throughout her glorious nomadic childhood, living all over Europe, England, Austria, Germany, France, Italy. She absorbed languages and knowledge like a sponge. That's my girl. Quick to learn, curious, eager for new experiences. Baba would proudly declare while indulging her every whim. He fed her love of knowledge, taught her to think, question, cheered when she argued. See her spirit, chip off the old block. Rani also absorbed her father's philosophy and made it her own. Socialism, equality for all. A society run by laymen, not autocrats. She read her father's copies of Marx's manifestos from cover to cover. She would engage in heated discussions with Baba and his socialist friends, Baba smiling fondly at her, his eyes gleaming with regard when she came up with a particularly good argument and his friends praised her. Your daughter is quite something, old chap. Isn't she just? Takes after her father. Fond pride twinkling in her Baba's gaze. Rani warmed by it. One up on her father, I'd say. Baba's celebratory laughter like festive fireworks. But you are a prince. Acquaintances shook their heads, perplexed when Rani's father declared himself a staunch socialist. Which is why I'm all the more against dictatorship, Baba proclaimed. Rani grew up believing in the right to a society where all were equal, fiercely against the oppression and injustices of an unequal world. Her father was her mentor and her best friend. You two are inseparable, her mother would laugh. Nothing can come between you. But India did. Chapter 4. Esme, 1990. A warm voice jolts Esme back into the present. She's in the office of the counsellor she'd picked out of the phone book, whose number she'd dialed before she lost her nerve. She is curled up in the chair opposite this woman who, although a stranger, doesn't feel like it. Her shoeless feet now tucked under her. The room smells sweet, of vanilla and understanding. I am sorry for your loss, Sally says, and Esme can see that she is. her brown eyes shining with empathy. Dad and I weren't particularly close, so I've been really stunned by the grief. It seems endless. Coming to terms with the death of a parent is very hard, regardless of what your relationship with them was like. Esme sniffs. I meant to visit him more. I did, but... It had shocked her to see how he'd changed, shrunk more every time she visited. The clothes that had once fit him so beautifully, hanging off his skinny frame. His bony shoulders slumping, his hands shaking, his tie askew, collar undone. It hurt to see this old man in place of the intelligent, always smart and well-turned-out father she remembered. And so her visits became longer and longer apart until they shriveled into none at all. Sally pushes the box of tissues towards her. Esme takes one, blows her nose noisily. My father, A magpie flies past the window behind Sally, which spills golden light into the room, illuminating the white walls, incandescent brightness. The magpie is a blur of black and white, a fluster of wings, one for sorrow. He was very remote, closed up. He kept himself at a remove, always. He'd always been quiet, reserved, and she'd learned, like her brother Andy had, to let him be, to retreat into herself, which is why her enduring memory of childhood was of them together, but apart. Dad providing for them materially, but emotionally and physically distant. During her visits to the hospice, they couldn't break the habits formed during a lifetime together, their conversation paltry, stilted, forced. Esme trying to hide her shock, her sorrow at his decline. She wanted to tell him she loved him. She resolved to before every visit, but the words died somewhere on their journey between her head and her mouth. The silence would fester, pulsing with unsaid words, held back declarations, until she broke it with an abrupt goodbye and left, crying all the way home. And Esme shreds the tissue in her hand. Yes, Sally prompts gently. I'm afraid I've turned out exactly like him. Chapter 5. Rani, 1937. The sleek letter on intricate headed paper had arrived just as Rani, at 16, was thinking of her future. She wanted to read languages at Cambridge, following, inevitably, in her father's footsteps. Her father was all for it. They were making arrangements to move to England. They were currently in Austria, where, like in the rest of Europe, tensions were building, the rumours that Hitler was going to invade Austria getting stronger with each passing day, so she could get settled in before beginning the process of applying. Always think ahead. Another of her father's maxims. Then the letter. It reeked of self-importance. It exuded gravitas with its solemn, gilt-edged linings, its smell of exotic lands, the oceans it had travelled. Never for a moment did Rani imagine that it had the power to so completely alter the direction of all of their lives. Baba had glared at the letter as if it was a grenade. Let's light a fire. That's the best place for it, he said. Mama went to him, laid a gentle palm upon his shoulder. He rested his cheek against it. Rani looked at the two of them, her parents, Baba's face resting on his wife's hand, her other hand stroking his hair, his eyes closed. It was an image she would always carry within her, a treasure she would cherish. "You should read it," Mama said, softly, tenderly. Afterwards, Rani would revisit that moment again and again. He should have gone with his instincts, burned it. But on that fateful day, Mama picked up the letter, handed it to Baba. He looked at it for a moment, shuddered, and then tore it open in one decisive swoop, like he did everything in life, quickly and without hesitation, facing down whatever it was he needed to do, especially that which he found distasteful. So many emotions flashing through Baba's face as he read the letter. His face was a study in upset when he finally looked up at them. "My father is dying. He wants to make peace, meet his grandchildren." He smiled at Rani and at Arjun, who was in Rani's lap, playing with her hair as he said this, his eyes haunted, shimmering with withheld emotion. "He wants us back." And although he looked sad, angry, hurt, his voice thrumming with bitterness and angst, Rani noticed, for she knew her father very well. Something else warring with this amalgam of feeling and winning. Hope, happiness, anticipation. And she knew then that although her father had denied it, he had missed India, perhaps even his father too. And she knew also as she noticed her father link his fingers with Mama's, as he smiled up at her, mouthed, "Thank you," that they would go to India. Chapter 6. Rani. Things started to change even before they arrived in India. As the ship sailed to warmer climes, as every day they came inexorably closer to the land of his birth, Baba's excitement was palpable. Mama beamed as she stood by his side, his gaze fixed upon the horizon beyond which lay the country where he'd grown up. The land he left behind, denounced, when he, according to his father, committed the twin cardinal sins of not only falling in love, but with a white woman at that, and not even white nobility, but, of all people, a Jew from merchant stock. Mama linking hands with Baba as he stood on deck looking east, Arjun running up to throw his arms around their legs, the sea lapping the ship behind them. The three of them grinning, Arjun from between his parents' knees, silhouetted against sun and sea. Dreamy blue merging into white gold, beyond which lay India. A happy tableau. Another image Rani would always carry with her, branded behind her eyelids. Watching them, she was aware of a curious lump in her throat. She blinked back sudden tears. They were all smiles in anticipation of the happy occasion. Reason for celebration. Baba reuniting with his family, returning to his homeland. Yet throughout this journey, Rani had been plagued by nightmares. She had been beset by foreboding. Chapter 7. Rani. Their first evening at sea, they were invited to dine with the captain and other first-class guests, Indian nobility and British Raj officials. Baba, for the first time, used his full name, the name he had used only a diminutive of in Europe. "I am Prajanya Raj." The other guests looked up, the music of cutlery on plates on pause. Of the Divanpur Maharajas? Yes. Baba was matter-of-fact. But Rani, who noticed how he was shredding his bread rolls into crumbs, knew he was nervous about slipping back into the persona he had abandoned years ago. Silence at their table, while around them in the dining room, aromatic with spices and grilled meat, rice and bread and caramelized sugar, the melodious chatter of guests, the clink of glasses, the respectful murmur of attending waiters as they brought in platter after platter of freshly prepared delicacies. The captain and the other guests scrutinizing them, Baba, Mama, Rani, Arjun. You are the son who's been... Baba's mouth tightening, pulling down at the corners ever so slightly, only Mama and Rani, privy to Baba's every expression, taking note. Arjun was oblivious. Baba's smile firmly in place. Yes. Mama's hand under the table seeking out her husband's. Now the captain beaming. I say, a real pleasure and honour, Your Highness. I'm not, Baba protested. But the tightness in his jaw had eased. He was smiling and it was genuine. And seeing his pleasure, Mama smiled too. Well, they say the Maharaja talks of nothing but you. He maintains the kingdom has not been the same since you left. I hear they've been planning celebrations in anticipation of your return for weeks, since you wrote to say you were coming, despite His Majesty being ill. The captain motioned to a waiter to top up the glasses of everyone at the table. A toast to the Crown Prince. Hear, hear. Rani watched her father being toasted, Arjun raising his cup of juice, Mama her wine, laughing happily. She felt sick. Her father would have eschewed this, even just a few days ago. The trappings of wealth, power, and renown. Her father was changing. As if he knew what she was thinking and wanted to reassure her, Baba sought her gaze, raised his glass to her, and winked. She had felt comforted then, briefly. But that night, in their luxurious cabin, her bed gently rocking to the rhythm of the sea, a rousing blur of royal blue as glimpsed through her porthole window, she couldn't sleep. And every night after, as she watched her father being sought out and feted, supremely comfortable in his new Crown Prince persona, dread sitting on her stomach, choking her chest. Baba is changing, she said to Mama, laying her head in the crook of her mother's neck as they watched their beloved father and husband being admired. He's happy to be going home, mein Lieb, my love, she said, gently patting Rani's hair. It's been so long, and I know that however much he's tried to hide it, a part of him has been hurting. Let him have this. Her mother couldn't understand. She couldn't see Baba shrug off the very principles that had made him the man he was, accepting everyone's adoration as his right instead of being embarrassed by it. Before, why are they fawning? He'd have grumbled. Just because I was born into a king's family, by virtue of the simple accident of birth? It's wrong. They shouldn't be clustering around me, hanging on my every word. We are all equal. No longer. Chapter 8. Rani. What about me? Rani had asked when Baba said they'd go to India. You, my darling? He looked puzzled, taking a minute for his starry eyes to focus on his daughter. We were going to move to England so I could apply to Cambridge. You can apply from India. He waved her concerns aside as if they were nothing. But when he said that, he hadn't met her eyes, his gaze wavering, and it worried her. Whatever happens, I will go to Cambridge, she told herself on board the ship, as she noted that she and Mama were the only women at the captain's table. The other nobles' wives, veiled like secrets, were relegated to their cabins. That made the monster choking Rani's chest more vicious, the vague foreboding all the more pressing. Why are all the other women covering their faces? Why are they not at the table? She queried. That's the custom, her father said. It's wrong. Baba looked around, making sure no one had heard Rani, something he'd never have done before, worrying about what people thought. You've got a feisty one there. One of the men fawning over her winked. Yes. Baba smiled back, but where before he'd have said it proudly, now it was pained, faltering, as if Rani was really embarrassing him. Afterwards, he came to find her. She was sitting on deck, staring at the sea which whispered and ruffled, grumbled and sang, seagulls joining in the chorus, the wavelets twinkling silver gold. She did not look up as he sat himself down beside her. The water was calming, an oasis of blue-green stretching away to infinity. Rani, Baba said softly. There was uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. She looked up at him then. This man she adored. This man she had looked up to unquestioningly, who was now proving himself lesser than she had thought. India. They do things differently there. I thought that is why you went away, made a life for yourself in Europe. Her voice sharp. He sighed, his hands crossed behind his head, looking at the sea, avoiding looking at her. She turned away too, watching the seagull hovering on the wide white awning of sky, like a stray thought at the edge of consciousness. We are just dots to them, she mused, and the thought was a comfort. You'll have to think before you speak, Rani. And now she was incensed. You taught me to speak my mind. He sighed again, for longer. I did, but... He took a breath. It's gone on for so long, this feud. The feud is between your father and you. Why should I change who I am? Now that she'd started, she couldn't stop. And why here? To please people you and I don't even know. To indulge their idea of how a woman should behave. Her father nodded then. Fair point. She was surprised. She hadn't expected this new, changed Baba to concede. She realised then that she was changing too, in how she felt about her beloved father, her expectations of him. He had always given weight to her opinions and taken them seriously. Before. I'd forgotten how the country changes me. Makes me wage a constant battle between who I am, the principles I hold dear, and what is expected of me. between what I want and what is perceived as my duty. We aren't even there yet, Rani said, softly. Exactly. Baba Rufal. It's why I left. That evening, he was her father of old, the man she loved and looked up to. But the next morning, when the shout thrumming with excitement rippled across the ship that land would be sighted soon, India, and he stood on deck gripping the rail as if it was a lifeline, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the dot of mud brown was delineating into a strip of land, his gaze longing and hope and eagerness, she knew somehow that she'd never have him to herself again. And so, she watched her beloved family standing against the ship's railing just before land came into view, the three people she loved most in the world smiling wide in anticipation of the future, with a feeling she would later understand was nostalgia and wistfulness. Her mother held out a hand to Rani. Come and join us. Come on, love. Baba beckoned, even as her brother smiled cheekily, one hand tucked into each parent's palm. Rani tasted salt that had nothing to do with the sea spray the wind whipped into her face, and everything to do with an urge to capture this moment, commit it to memory, her heart thick with a premonition that nothing was ever going to be the same again. She had closed her eyes then, thrown her face up to the sun, bright hot and dazzling, until she felt arms around her and sank, gratefully, into her father's musk and ginger embrace. Chapter 9. Esme, 1990. Why do you fear you've turned out like your father? Sally asks, her voice soothing like flowing water. Their second session together. After the first, Esme had gone home and cried, but these were cathartic tears, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she was able to sleep for a solid 5 hours, a marked improvement on the patchy, nightmare-tortured 2 to 3 hours she'd been getting. I'm afraid of commitment. Philip, she thinks. I'm so sorry. I'm here. I'm trying. I only hope it's not too late for us. Your father was too? Yes. But he was married. Mum died when I was a baby. Dad brought us up. Us. My brother and myself. Esme takes a breath. I don't remember my mum. Her voice small. What about your brother? He doesn't either. And Dad never spoke about her. We knew not to mention her. He'd become even more closed up. I see. He never remarried? No. No one significant? No. You might not have known about... He went to work, came home, and worked some more. Or read. He was always either reading or working. There wasn't anyone else. Ah. He did not share himself with anyone. Not even us. Her mouth salty wet. If she was to frame her childhood in a snapshot, it would be this. Her father, back from work, sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, lost in words. Esme at the table, doing homework. Andy out somewhere on his bike. When she was stuck on a question, calling, "Dad, I need help!" Embers crackling in the fireplace. orange flames topped by dancing blue, the scent of roasting meat, pots clanking in the kitchen, her father looking up at her, after she'd called him twice, sometimes thrice, too absorbed in his book, blinking, that familiar, preoccupied, slightly abstract look on his face. Chapter 10. Rani. India, 1937. Her father's brother was waiting for them at the port. It was like watching Baba's clone, the resemblance uncanny. He was wearing a bejewelled turban and robes that glittered and dazzled, and a wide smile that didn't. He joined his palms and bowed respectfully as his older brother stepped off the ship, but Baba, who was glowing in a way Rani had not seen before, gathered his younger brother into a hug. Uncle smiled when introduced to Arjun, but upon seeing Mama and Rani, his face tightened, the grin freezing. He took Baba aside, and there was a heated discussion. Rani could see, although they were talking in whispers, that it was urgent and intense. The glow leaving Baba's face, his back rigid. Mama wringing her hands as she too picked up on the tension. Uncle turned to the army of turbaned men clad in shimmering robes, not as intricately patterned or as brilliant and choked with jewels as Uncle's, but eye-catching all the same, clustering behind him, who, Rani realised, were waiting to do his bidding. At a gesture from Uncle, a couple of them scurried away, only to return shortly carrying 2 pieces of glittery, sequined silk. All the while, the brothers talked, but it was evident it wasn't a happy discussion. Her father's shoulders tense, the muscles in his neck straining. Now he turned, walking up to Mama and Rani. His eyes tormented as he looked at his wife and his daughter in turn. My father, he's old-fashioned. A pause while his jaw worked, even as he struggled to speak. Come out with it, Rani thought, heart sinking. Uncle watched, his face grim. You will be required to cover your faces with these veils. Baba shamefaced and apologetic as he handed them the fluttering wisps of silk. Now Rani understood their purpose. And you'll be staying in the Zenana, the women's section of the palace. The words strangled, even as they were delivered in a stumbling rush. What does that mean? Rani challenged. The Zenana is located in the interior of the palace, a whole vast section set apart for royal women. Before Rani could interject further, Mama nodded gently. She said, softly, even as she wore the silk like a scarf, Don't you worry about us. Baba's gaze now capturing Rani's, pleading with his eyes. He's an old man, dying. He's my father. I must humour him. You must? Why should I? Uncle's eyes flashed daggers at her. Baba sighed. Please. Uncle turned away, his palms bunched into fists, angry, Rani could see, with his older brother remonstrating with a child instead of ordering her to do as she was told. She thought of what Baba had said on deck that evening. I'd forgotten how the country changes me. Makes me wage a constant battle between who I am, the principles I hold dear, and what is expected of me. Between what I want and what is perceived as my duty. She loved her father, and despite their differences, her father loved his own. She fingered the silk, soft as a heart tender with love, slippery as a newly minted resolution. It was just for a short while, to please a dying man, her grandfather. But it went against her principles, her every instinct. Mama squeezed her hand, her eyes iridescent, framed by the veil the colour of sea spray gilded rose by evening's glow. Do this, she was conveying, silently, for your Baba. Rani nodded, inwardly sighing. Her father smiled in relief. Chapter 11. Rani. India was like nothing Rani had imagined. Heat and dust and obscene wealth lording over unimaginable poverty. Not that she got more than the merest glimpse of life outside the palace, viewed through the barrier of veil her uncle had procured for her and her mother to wear, during their journey from the port to the palace. And once at the palace, Rani and Mama were relegated to the zenana without a by or leave. The zenana was a cloistered section within the palace which was guarded even more securely than the palace itself and better fortified than any prison. Mama and Rani were led through winding corridors until they came to a gate set into high walls that were topped by broken glass, the sharp, uneven edges pointing at the sky, glinting forbiddingly in the blinding sunlight, dazzling white. Women clad in khaki saris and matching turbans stamped with the royal insignia, sporting belts adorned with spears, cudgels and knives and carrying guns, patrolled the wall. The zenana, it dawned on Rani, as she and Mama were led inside, was a jail of women, albeit luxurious, ensconced within high walls. Even the children she saw playing in the lawns and courtyards were girls. No boys over 5, the maid, wearing a sari, the celebratory ruby of joy, chosen to accompany them because she was the only one who could speak English, explained haltingly when Rani questioned this. All the boys stay at main palace and then go to boarding school. The zenana was a town in itself, buildings interconnected by canopied walkways, surrounded by elaborate gardens where peacocks showed off their magnificent plumage, immaculate lawns ringing with the musical chatter of women, the tinkling of anklets, singing bangles, children's laughter, glorious as applause, palm trees, fruit orchards, rose arbours, twinkling pools. Monkeys regarded them curiously while hanging upside down from mango and jackfruit trees, clutching babies to their stomachs. Children played hide-and-seek while women flitted about in kaleidoscopic saris like exotic birds. No veils, as there were no men, so no need to cover their faces. Their hair gleaming in ebony plaits and buns, their voices as gentle and soothing as the burbling waters of the various fountains dotted about the courtyards, separating the regal and splendiferous, domed and turreted abodes. Each of these belongs to a Maharani, the maid pointed out. Finally, after walking past several buildings, attracting attention from children and monkeys alike, maids stopping what they were doing to surreptitiously point at Rani and Mama and whisper among themselves, they arrived at a domed, pillared building more vast and spread out than all the others. The Maharaja wanted you to have the biggest residence. His first wife, the Maharani Usha, had to move to that building over there. She's not happy about it. The maid explained, pointing to a building to her left. First wife? mused Rani. We would have preferred not to stay here at all. Why can't we stay with our father and brother? Why do we have to be separated from them and wear veils in the presence of men? She cried in her head. She had tried remonstrating with her father yet again when they arrived at the palace, but both he and her mother had pleaded with her to please go with it for the time being, respect the Maharaja's wishes as he was so very ill. The interior of Rani and Mama's residence in the Zanana was sumptuous, brimming with antiques and treasures. There were endless rooms furnished with tapestries, chandeliers casting glinting rainbows on the exotic furniture, wall hangings, antiques studded with jewels, mirrored screens, kaleidoscopic and glittering, assaulting the eye with their dazzling brilliance. Maids dusting and polishing, mopping and cleaning, their anklets providing chiming accompaniment. The ceilings painted with nuanced scenes of battle, the stately carpets draping the marble floors gloriously soft and intricately patterned. The maid gestured for them to sit, and Rani sank into a chaise longue, enveloped by its silky velvet caress. Mama reclined opposite on an elaborate divan and smiled at Rani as maids arrived, bearing food. Honeyed cashew nuts, spiced peanuts, caramelized almonds and salted pistachios, dates and papaya, mango and watermelon and jackfruit, Indian sweets shaped like flowers, decorated with silver foil, studded with nuts and shiny with syrup, spicy fried snacks, platter after platter. The zesty, sugar-soaked aroma making Rani's senses tingle and her stomach advertise how hungry she was with an embarrassing growl. Mama reached for a samosa. Aren't you eating, Mendleep? Despite her valiant efforts at normalcy, Mama appeared lost and more than a little out of her depth. No, Rani wouldn't eat. This wasn't home. It couldn't be, for despite its opulent luxury, all she could see was what was missing. Her brother, her father. Their family spliced in two, divided by walls and gender. Just as Rani had feared, her father changed even more in India, became a domineering stranger. If someone had told Rani that her father would become like his father, the man he professed to hate, whom he'd rejected and whose way of life he'd spurned, adopting socialist ideals, marrying a German Jew instead of taking over the throne, and merging kingdoms by marrying the princess his father chose for him, she would have laughed, disbelieving. If she hadn't watched him transform, conform, and what's more, force his family to conform to ideals he'd rebelled against, she wouldn't have believed it. But he did, and it devastated her to see him turn his back on his principles, take on everything he'd rebelled against before her shocked and disbelieving eyes. Her mistake was believing her father when he asserted it was temporary, a small concession to humour his dying father. Rani and Mama were yet to meet Baba's father, the excuse being that he was not up to it. But Rani found out from Arjun that he had had an audience with his grandfather. He even smiled and patted my cheek, Arjun told Rani. His hands were very cold. Why can't Mama and I see your father, given the reason we are here is because he wanted to reconcile with you and meet your family? Rani asked Baba. He's ill and not up to visitors, as I've told you already, Baba said shortly. But Arjun is the exception as he's the heir to the crown prince, Rani challenged. And to this, Baba had no reply. Rani would not accept that her own father would transform so, even as she worried that when his father died and Baba was crowned king, he would grow to enjoy the power he was invested with, forget his principles and, worse, renege on his promises to his wife and daughter, turn his back on his vow that his daughter would attend university, forget their happy life before, a tight, close-knit family unit, forget everything. "But Baba!" Rani cried when her father and Arjun visited them in the zenana. "What about my education?" This was when she still believed he'd listened to her, hoped whatever he was doing was just a phase, before she became completely disillusioned and gave up on him. "All in good time, my love. For now, you—" She didn't let him finish. "So Mama and I are stuck in here, having to wear veils and twiddling our thumbs. Just for a while. What about equality? For man and woman? For everyone?" Her father looked around to make sure no one had heard, colour seeping into his face. "Shh, Rani. Ashamed of your daughter or the principles you propounded so passionately?" He was quiet, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Her father, who once, not too long ago, was so proud of her outspokenness, encouraging it, cheering her on with glowing regard. "That's my girl." "How long do we have to stay here?" Her father didn't answer. Chapter 12. Rani, 1938. The zenana was extravagantly spacious, yet beyond claustrophobic. Her mother determinedly cheery, but in unguarded moments when she thought no one was watching, Rani could see Mama drooping. Rani felt for her. Displaced from home in a country so far away, in a closed-off section of the palace reserved only for women, living, except for Rani, with strangers, apart from her husband and her son for the first time. In luxurious surroundings, with all the trappings of royalty, yes, but no freedom. A prison with all the comforts bar the warmth of loved ones. This country with its alien customs and language she just could not muster. She didn't share her children's instinctive flair for languages. Harsh, unrelenting sun heralding day after day of the same trapped boredom, for there was nothing for the royal women confined to the zenana to do except dress up and wait for and upon their men whenever they deemed fit to visit them. Their duty was to provide their men with male heirs, the more the better. But the tragedy was that they couldn't look after their own children even if they wanted to. There were specially trained ayahs for this. And in any case, the royal heirs were whisked away to the main palace and onwards to boarding school when they turned 5. The girl children married off by the time they attained puberty. It was not deemed queenly to care for your own child, to cook or do any menial task when there was a maid for the very purpose. In the absence of anything constructive to fill their time with, the women thrived on gossip and one-upmanship, which went against Mama's gentle, sweet nature. Mama had come to India for love of her husband, but her husband had abandoned her in here with women who resented her for being the soon-to-be king's wife, given the biggest and best residence, and worse, a Firangi, foreigner, and the only white woman who'd barely been here 2 minutes. Rani did not let on that she was picking up the language more with every passing day. Within a few weeks, she could understand what all the other women cloistered in the zenana with them were gossiping about. Her grandfather's and uncle's many wives, another shock, some of them younger than Rani. Her grandfather's wives were bitter because they'd been stripped of their status as queen consorts, her uncles because they would have been queens if not for this white usurper. Rani's mother was pleasant and kind and genuinely friendly to all the other women in the zenana, greeting them politely in the broken words of Hindi she had mustered. It was more than they deserved. These vipers with their venomous snake eyes who grumbled viciously about poor, beloved Mama. "Talk to Baba, please," Rani had urged. She was not talking to her father herself. Only very rarely on those occasions when she couldn't get out of it, and then very formally. "Ask him to allow us a holiday to Germany, to visit with Opa and Oma. He's finding his way back into the fold of family. He needs us with him." Mama sighed. "This is needing us?" Rani laughed harshly, humorlessly, waving a hand around her. "He doesn't see us. He's left us in here to rot."